pictures of the meeting at the end. Her room looked to the back, and was in a side wing away from the principal state apartments. Consequently, she was not roused to suspicion by any of the commotion. But, indeed, if she had heard the banging of doors, the sharp directions, the carriage wheels, she would still not have suspected the truth. Her own love was too faithful. It was 4 o'clock and past when some one knocked at her door, and, on entering, gave her a note which Mrs Bellingham had left. That lady had found some difficulty in wording it so as to satisfy herself, but it was as follows: "My son, on recovering from his illness, is, I thank God, happily conscious of the sinful way in which he has been living with you. By his earnest desire, and in order to avoid seeing you again, we are on the point of leaving this place. But before I go, I wish to exhort you to repentance, and to remind you that you will not have your own guilt alone upon your head, but that of any young man whom you may succeed in entrapping into vice. I shall pray that you may turn to an honest life, and I strongly recommend you, if indeed you are not dead in trespasses and sins, to enter some penitentiary. In accordance with my son's wishes, I forward you in this envelope a banknote of £50. Margaret Bellingham." Was this the end of all? Had he indeed gone? She started up, and asked this last question of the servant, who, half guessing at the purport of the note, had lingered about the room, curious to see the effect produced. "Yes, indeed, miss. The carriage drove from the door as I came upstairs. You'll see it now on the Yspytty Road, if you'll please to come to the window of number 24. Ruth started up and followed the chambermaid. Ay, there it was, slowly winding up the steep white road, on which it seemed to move at a snail's pace. She might overtake him. She might speak one farewell word to him, print his face on her heart with a last look. Nay, when he saw her, he might retract, and not utterly, for ever, leave her. Thus she thought, and she flew back to her room, and snatching up her bonnet, ran, tying the strings with her trembling hands as she went down the stairs, out at the nearest door, little heeding the angry words of Mrs Morgan; for the hostess, more irritated at Mrs Bellingham's severe upbraiding at parting than mollified by her ample payment, was offended by the circumstances of Ruth, in her wild haste, passing through the prohibited front door. But Ruth was away before Mrs Morgan had finished her speech, out and away, scudding along the road, thought lost in the breathless rapidity of her motion. Though her heart and head beat almost to bursting, what did it signify if she could but overtake the carriage? It was a nightmare, constantly evading the most passionate wishes and endeavours, and constantly gaining ground. Every time it was visible, it was in fact more distant, but Ruth would not believe it. If she could but gain the summit of that weary, everlasting hill, she believed that she could run again, and would soon be nigh upon the carriage. As she ran, she prayed, with wild eagerness, she prayed that she might see his face once more, even if she died on the spot before him. It was one of those prayers which God is too merciful to grant; but, despairing and wild as it was, Ruth put her soul into it, and prayed it again and yet again. Wave above wave of the ever-rising hills were gained, were crossed, and at last Ruth struggled up to the very top, and stood on the bare table of moor, brown and purple, stretching far away till it was lost in the haze of the summer afternoon. The white road was all flat before her, but the carriage she sought, and the figure she sought, had disappeared. There was no human being there. A few wild, black-faced mountain sheep, quietly grazing near the road, as if it were long since they had been disturbed by the passing of any vehicle, was all the life she saw on the bleak moorland. She threw herself down on the ling by the side of the road in despair. Her only hope was to die, and she believed she was dying. She could not think, she could not believe anything. Surely life was a horrible dream, and God would mercifully awaken her from it. She had no penitence, no consciousness of error or offence, no knowledge of any one circumstance but that he was gone. Yet afterwards, long afterwards, she remembered the exact motion of a bright green beetle busily meandering among the wild thyme near her, and she recalled the musical, balanced, wavering drop of a skylark into her nest, near the heather bed where she lay. The sun was sinking low; the hot air had ceased to quiver near the hotter earth, when she bethought her once more of the note which she had impatiently thrown down before half mastering its contents. "Oh, perhaps," she thought, "I have been too hasty. There may be some words of explanation from him on the other side of the page, to which, in my blind anguish, I never turned. I will go and find it." She lifted herself heavily and stiffly from the crushed heather. She stood dizzy and confused with her change of posture, and was so unable to move at first, that her walk was but slow and tottering. But by and by she was tasked and goaded by thoughts which forced her into rapid motion, as if, by it, she could escape from her agony. She came down on the level ground, just as many gay or peaceful groups were sauntering leisurely home with hearts at ease, with low laughs and quiet smiles, and many an exclamation at the beauty of the summer evening. Ever since her adventure with a little boy and his sister, Ruth had habitually avoided encountering these happy innocents, may I call them, these happy fellow mortals; and even now the habit grounded on sorrowful humiliation had power over her. She paused, and then, on looking back, she saw more people who had come into the main road from a side path. She opened a gate into a pasture field, and crept up to the hedgebank until all should have passed by, and she could steal into the inn unseen. She sat down on the sloping turf by the roots of an old hawthorn tree which grew in the hedge. She was still tearless, with hot burning eyes. She heard the merry walkers pass by. She heard the footsteps of the village children as they ran along to their evening play. She saw the small black cows come into the fields after being milked, and life seemed yet abroad. When would the world be still and dark, and fit for such a deserted, desolate creature as she was? Even in her hiding place she was not long at peace. The little children, with their curious eyes peering here and there, had peeped through the hedge and through the gate, and now they gathered from all the four corners of the hamlet, and crowded round the gate, and one more adventurous than the rest had run into the field to cry, "Give me a halfpenny," which set the example to every little one, emulous of his boldness. And there, where she sat low on the ground, and longing for the sure hiding place earth gives to the weary, the children kept running in, and pushing one another forwards, and laughing. Poor things, their time had not come for understanding what sorrow is. Ruth would have begged them to leave her alone, and not madden her utterly; but they knew no English save the one eternal "Give me a halfpenny." She felt in her heart that there was no pity anywhere. Suddenly, while she doubted God, a shadow fell across her garments, on which her miserable eyes were bent. She looked up. The deformed gentleman she had twice before seen stood there. He had been attracted by the noisy little crowd, and had questioned them in Welsh; but, not understanding enough of the language to comprehend their answers, he had obeyed their signs, and entered the gate to which they pointed. There he saw the young girl whom he had noticed at first for her innocent beauty, and the second time for the idea he had gained respecting her situation. There he saw her, crouched up like some hunted creature, with a wild, scared look of despair, which almost made her lovely face seem fierce, He saw